Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today I am reporting live from the Bell Center post-game of the Sharks game versus the Montreal Canadiens, in which the Sharks managed to win 4-2. It is pretty reminiscent of last year's game against the Montreal Canadiens, the turnaround game for the San Jose Sharks that season, in which they won 3-1, but they were mostly outplayed, or at least very much outshot in that one. Again, happening here tonight. The Canadiens, you could definitely argue, were the better team, even if the Sharks did get the victory, but you could also argue the Sharks were pretty competitive in those games against the Sabres, even though they did lose. So a strong game from the Sharks all around as the Zamboni passes by behind me, and I will have a further review when I get home. Class dismissed for now. Class is back in session. I am Professor Hockey once again, and today we will continue discussing the game between the Sharks and the Canadiens, in which the Sharks managed to win 4-2. And as I said, the Sharks didn't play that great of a game, but at this point it doesn't particularly matter. The Sharks started the day off last place in the Pacific Division. They basically just need to get the 2 points, whether they play fantastically or whether they play awful. They need the 2 points, and that's what happened here tonight. It was a pretty hard-fought 2 points. And so the first period, it didn't start off too well for the Sharks. They didn't look that great. It was a goal for Nick Cousins, and of course the Sharks don't have the best record this season when they give up that first goal, but Evander Kane managed to tie it late in the first on the power play. And come the second period, the Sharks definitely looked their best. Early, first 10 or so minutes of that period, they were very, very good. They got a couple extra goals from Kane and LeBanc. And then eventually, late in the second, the Sharks and the Canadiens exchanged goals, Melker Karlsson and Joel Armia. And going into the third period, there was no more offense from either team. The Sharks did a pretty good job at locking things down, and they took the victory, as they have done many times against the Montreal Canadiens in the past. First thing to talk about would be Aaron Dell, who had himself a very solid game, made some key saves for the Sharks. I do have to give some credit to the Sharks defense, who managed to limit a lot of the good chances the Canadiens did get. But when the Canadiens did get those offensive chances, those grade A chances, Dell was normally there to make the saves. A couple good glove saves, a couple scrambles in front that he managed to hold strong in. And so it was an impressive game from Aaron Dell. And depending on how Jones actually does tomorrow against the Toronto Maple Leafs, we'll see if Aaron Dell actually gets another game at some point on this road trip. It's hard to keep up on the road, playing 5 games here, moving across the eastern side of the United States as well as Canada. And so Dell may actually, in fact, find him in nets for one more game, unless Jones really puts up an impressive performance against the Leafs, which sort of forces the hand of DeBoer to give him the next couple of games. But still, an all-around impressive performance from Dell tonight. Next to talk about would be the power play, which it, along with the penalty kill, has really managed to keep the Sharks afloat in this season. Yes, they don't have the best record, but if they didn't have their power play clicking here in these past few games at a really high level and the penalty kill being among the top in the league, they'd probably find themselves last place just in general, because the 5-on-5 scoring has just been awful for the Sharks. They're not getting enough of it, and they're giving up too much of it. But even though the power play started abysmally, 0 for 14 or 0 for 15 with 3 shorthanded goals against, it has really recovered. It has adapted to the departure of Joe Pavelski. There's some very good movement along the edges of the zone between Hurdle, down low, LeBanc along the wall, Couture along the wall, and then either Karlsson or Burns up high. We saw even LeBanc go down low at a point. It's very fluid, and with Kane cleaning up in the middle of the ice, who I believe he has like 5 of his 6 goals or 4 of his 6 goals on the power play, it has been very good for the Sharks. Next, I will talk exactly about Kane, as he, of course, ended up with the 2 power play goals here tonight. He actually played a pretty solid game at even strength as well. I think something that really showed that was the last few couple minutes of the third period. The Canadiens had the goalie pulled. Kane had a very good shift in the offensive zone with Hurdle trying to get that empty netter, and of course it didn't end up coming. Kane did not get his second hat-trick of the year, but it was still impressive to have been able to kill off the clock for that long. Evander Kane just playing a solid game all around, and we know Kane is definitely a streaky player. We saw last season he had about a 25-game stretch where he was one of the Sharks' best players, just racking up goal after goal. He dealt with those personal issues late in the season and then didn't really have that great of a playoffs, but we've come here to start the season. It's important to recall he actually was suspended for the first 3 games, so he has these 6 goals just through 7 games. And we know Kane, we know what he is at his peak, that he's a player who could potentially get up to the 70-point mark or even more than that, but because of his streakiness, he's always been more of a 50 to 60-point guy. Hopefully, at this point, Kane can actually keep up his performance for the entire year. I don't know. He's not old, but he's old enough where you're sort of set in your ways. And so I don't know if that's going to be the case, but at the very least, we can hope that Kane does show up for the playoffs eventually down the line if the Sharks do make it in at this point, because they definitely need him to be at the level he is currently playing at now. Next, and finally, I will talk about Tim Heed. He did get the game here tonight, as there isn't really much of a better option just due to injuries for the San Jose Sharks, but Heed only ended up getting about 3 minutes here tonight, just about a couple of shifts, which didn't look particularly good for himself. And I suspect that as soon as someone like Dalton Prout or, hopefully Radim Shemek comes back from injury, Tim Heed will basically find himself on the bench for a while, as it seemed as though once he did re-sign as an unrestricted free agent for the Sharks, he'd get an opportunity being the sixth defenseman due to the departure of Justin Braun, but I just don't think DeBoer likes him at all, so maybe Heed will find himself waived, maybe Heed will find himself traded if he has any sort of trade value at all, but it seems as though once Prout does come back, even if Prout isn't that great of a defenseman, he seems to be preferable to Tim Heed, and then once Shemek comes back, we'll likely see what the Sharks' top six will actually look like. It'll be interesting though, because Shemek and Ferraro as the fifth and sixth defenseman are both left-handed players, and so if Burns goes with Shemek and Carlson goes with Dillon, we'll have Vlasic and Ferraro together, both left-handed defensemen, which I know Peter DeBoer doesn't like, but I'm sure we will have to manage because Shemek and Ferraro are just miles better than the other options of Prout and Heed, and I guess Middleton as well. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow. In fact, they'll face off against the Toronto Maple Leafs, as we know the Canadiens are a solid team. They're well built, but they don't necessarily have the offensive upside that the Toronto Maple Leafs have. Even without Tavares, they still got players like Matthews and Marner, and so Dell put up a solid performance here tonight against the Canadiens, letting in just 2 goals. Jones will have to put up a similar performance, if not better, to try and limit the Maple Leafs goals as well if the Sharks actually still want to take the 2 points. And coming in on the second half of a back-to-back, it's certainly not going to be an easy game, so we'll see how the Sharks perform in that one, and we'll see also how Patrick Marleau performs in his reunion with his old team. Class dismissed.